Great. Good afternoon from Delhi. My name is Constantino Xavier. I'm a fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, CSEP, based here in Delhi. And it's a great pleasure to have all of you here joining us for a Sambandh seminar discussion that's going to be held online, which is part of our research initiative called Sambandh on regional connectivity issues in South Asia. And the topic for today is Nepal, Sri Lanka, and South Asia's India-China competition. It's wonderful to have many of you that registered for this, but it's particularly wonderful to have these great speakers here with us, 4 of them. And what really brings us today together is 2 books, 2 excellent books that I thought would be good to discuss jointly because they are about 2 of India's neighbors, 2 critical countries in South Asia, 2 very different countries, one on the northern end of South Asia, sandwiched between India and China, Nepal. The second book on a country that is on the other extreme of South Asia, together with the Maldives, Sri Lanka, an island state south of India in the heart of the Indian Ocean. So the first book is by Amish Mulmi. Welcome, Amish. You're joining us from Kathmandu. How are you?
Thank you, Tino. Thank you, CSEP, for having me over.
Thank you,
Really
Amish.
looking forward to this discussion.
Great to have you, and hello to Kathmandu. This is the book by Amish. This is the Indian edition, right, Amish? I think by Context, the publisher. It's also
Yes,
out
that's right.
by Hearst in the UK, I think soon or already worldwide. And it is a book that really looks at, the subtitle says it all, Nepal's turn to China. And the picture says it also. I assume this is Razuvagadi?
No, this is Tatapani. This is a 2000 picture.
Good. So this is facing China?
Yeah, that's
Great.
right.
So Amish, welcome. Let me introduce briefly Amish. Amish is a Nepali writer based in Kathmandu, as I mentioned. He's a consulting editor with the Writer Side Literary Agency. Previously based in Delhi for several years, Amish worked as a digital editor at Juggernaut Books and also had worked as commissioning editor with Hachette India and as a columnist, still as a columnist with the Kathmandu Post, where he writes regularly a fascinating column on Nepal's international history and international context. Welcome, Amish. The second and equally important reason that we are here is this fine book by Asanga Abeyagoonasekera. Asanga published this book very recently, I think a few months ago. Maybe you can see the cover well. I only have the digital edition. The book is called Conundrum of an Island, Sri Lanka's Geopolitical Challenges, published by World Scientific. In fact, the online edition is also very easy to get. That's the PDF I got online. Asanga is an international security and geopolitics analyst and strategic advisor from Sri Lanka. Welcome, Asanga. Welcome to you calling us from.
Thanks, Tino. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And welcome to everyone joining us from Colombo and Sri Lanka. Asanga is currently an advisor to the leader of opposition in the Sri Lankan parliament. He's also led in the past government think tanks, providing strategic advocacy, and has almost 2 decades of experience in the government sector in various advisory positions. He was the founding Director General of the National Security Think Tank under the Ministry of Defense until January last year, 2020. Previously also served as Executive Director at another very prominent think tank in Sri Lanka, the Lakshman Kadiramar Institute of International Relations and Strategic Studies. In fact, let me also recommend 2 of Asanga's previous books, Sri Lanka at Crossroads from 2019 and Towards a Better World Order 2015. Let me also introduce our 2 discussants who are here with us. We're lucky to have with us Nilanti Samarnayak joining us from Washington. Good morning to DC and good morning to you, Nilanti.
Good morning, Tino. Good evening in India and elsewhere in the region.
Thank you, Nilanti. Nilanti directs the Strategy and Policy Analysis Program at CNA, a research institution, think tank in the Washington, D.C. area. Since joining CNA in 2010, it's been 10 years, Nilanti, she's led several studies on the Indian Ocean and South Asian security. Recently, Nilanti has worked on US-India naval cooperation, water resource competition in the Brahmaputra River Basin. In fact, a wonderful book co-authored on the Brahmaputra water politics and the northeastern region of South Asia, and Sri Lankan foreign policy. She's also conducted research on the navies of Bangladesh and Pakistan, the Maldives Coast Guard, security threats in the Bay of Bengal, and relations between smaller South Asian countries and China, India, and the US, all very important issues for today. Last but not least, my colleague at CSEP, Antara Singh Gosal. Antara is a research associate at CSEP, where she focuses on China's foreign and security policies, and is also working on China's relations with India and South Asia. Welcome, Antara, next door here in Delhi.
Thank you, Tino, and it's a pleasure to be here today discussing this very important topic, these very interesting books. So yeah, I look forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Antara. Antara is a graduate from Tsinghua University in Beijing, the School of Public Policy and Management. She's also been a Chinese language fellow at the National Central University of Taiwan. Prior to CSEP, she's also worked at the Delhi Policy Group, the National Maritime Foundation, and the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, all prominent think tanks right here in Delhi. She's currently working also with us on a project on Chinese non-economic influence in South Asia and mapping that. So good. Quick word about the Sambandh initiative to everyone joining us and is not very aware of what we do before we jump into the discussion. At CSEP, we focus a lot on South Asia. It's in fact the main focus area of our foreign policy program. And I do encourage all of you joining us here today, assuming you're interested in these issues on South Asia, to look at some of our publications. My colleague Riya Sinha, for example, has co-authored with me last year a project and a paper on India-Nepal infrastructure connectivity. She also worked on trade in South Asia and is actually working on a fascinating paper coming up on India's border management institutions, the integrated checkposts on the land borders with Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, and Bangladesh. Another colleague of mine, Sanit Chakradeo, published recently a fascinating piece on humanitarian assistance and disaster response in South Asia, and has mapped India's contributions to regional disaster response mechanisms over the last 20 years. He's also working currently on a very interesting piece of work on air connectivity in South Asia and how fragmented the region has become in terms of flight connections and passenger traffic, and how it is slowly reintegrating. My other colleague, Nitika Nayar, is working, for example, on the Ministry of External Affairs diplomatic capacity to staff the diplomatic missions in the region, and how India's diplomatic system is represented across this region, and mapping it from the 1950s until today to see the size of the missions, the representation at these missions. There's several of them papers and research we are doing on development assistance, electricity, inland waterways, road connectivity, rail connectivity, India-China, geopolitical interactions, South Asia. Please do look up those papers. And last and maybe most importantly, part of our team and really guiding us in these endeavors is Ambassador Shivshanka Menon. He's a distinguished fellow at CSEP, former National Security Advisor and Foreign Secretary of India with a distinguished diplomatic career in the Indian Foreign Service. And let me just give a heads up because his next book is coming up. It's being released on April 20th. It's on India and Asian geopolitics, past, present. A fascinating book on how India looks at Asia that we will be also launching at CSEP. Good, so let's go into the discussion. We basically invite everyone to send us questions in the chat box, the participants. Please, I've received a few already, but please do share your questions and I'll try to select as many as possible. We'll start with a quick take by the two authors of these fine books, and then remarks by the two discussants, Nilanti and Antara, and then open it up also to a larger discussion and conversation over the last sort of 40 minutes. So Asanga, if we may start with you then, and give us a little overview, maybe in 5 minutes, over on what led you to write this book and your key takeaways of this book. Over to you, Asanga.
Thanks, Tino. Yeah, so I mean, I really appreciate the invitation and thank you. Basically, so my writing, the book begins with the Easter Sunday terror attack. The first chapter captures the national security, basically the environment of national security in Sri Lanka, where 250 lives were lost. In one of the largest, it was the historical largest terror attack ever took place in a single day. And discussing basically what were the issues that we didn't sort of we lacked or we couldn't capture, because serving as this was written at the time I was the Director General of the National Security Think Tank. So I served while serving there, as well as most of the writing was captured during that time. So, well, I discuss of the cardinals, Malcolm Ranjit, who actually is speaking about this serious concern that there should be justice for these victims. And it is already been discussed right now in the Sri Lankan society. There are 3 commissions been put up, and there is no justice still. So this month is the second year anniversary of them, and the book is actually try to capture the regional security concerns that are not being regional security architectures that are not present in the region, what we need. So, for example, the minilateral which was signed between India and Maldives and Sri Lanka, a suggestion which was in the book, and then it came to reality, and which is a great thing, and that was a huge success. So I think that as a region, we need to sort of work more closely on dealing with either extremism or dealing with maritime security, dealing with, I sort of look at it, even bringing in the non-traditional security concerns, on the HADR, as well as many other areas on security. So it's sort of a very large, a wider prism of thoughts on security. And then how did such vital information, like in the 2019 January, the threat forecasts go unheard and nobody, and this was actually highlighted in the new PCOI Presidential Commission report, where one of my analysis is being captured in the Presidential Commission report, that in January 2019, when the detonators were found there. So we found that there is a serious national security concern, but why? I think the state at that time, where I discussed the same challenge in the democracies chapter, where the stronger state as well as stronger civil society, sort of where I bring in the works of Hobbes, as well as asking for a stronger Leviathan, and also the where Sirisena Wickremesinghe regime tried to sort of strengthen the civil society. And so there is a sort of debate in that particular chapter where I try to sort of understand myself what were the concerns where the regime tried to strengthen the civil society, but then you have right now the present regime, which is a stronger state, a more stronger militaristic, as well as you have a completely a regime which is which was written on the one of the chapters which I captured was exactly the present environment. And then I moved to the geopolitics, basically, where I tried, it's like as a catapult, basically pull from the local and capturing the regional, and then going to the larger geopolitical challenges that Sri Lanka has. Situated at a geostrategic location at the sea lines of communications in the Indian Ocean, where Sri Lanka is, I say, sandwiched between BRI and Indo-Pacific. Does Sri Lanka has a binary choice? Then I try to argue, bring in the Sri Lankan foreign policy from the past with the non-aligned, and then from the Mahinda Rajapaksa regime, where I served for 10 years for President Mahinda Rajapaksa, now the Prime Minister. And I try to sort of see at that time how his balance of foreign policy with the non-aligned concept behind, and the how he tried to sort of balance, and then the China tilt even at that time, and then the revisit by his brother Gotabaya Rajapaksa right now to the same position, where I sort of put it across that they were bandwagoning with China right now. So a binary choice is quite difficult for a country like Sri Lanka, where I sort of try to sort of bring in an idea that Sri Lanka could work with the middle powers, and also strengthen the whatever the loans that we have taken, as well as the transparency, the opaqueness is a question. The volume is, I talk about the debt trap diplomacy. Sri Lanka, some of the scholars does speak about, say, look, the volume is not so much, so it's not a concern, but I don't agree with them. I think the opaqueness is a concern, the non-transparency is a concern. So getting those things right is the duty of the government. You see, we wanted Hambantota, we wanted Matala, all these projects. So if the flights are not coming, it's our concern. So I kind of question our inability, the government's inability, where sort of we wanted these projects and then we could not bring in the returns. So the Chinese inroads to the foreign policy, as well as I look at it, the regional sphere, I look at it how Chinese PLA operation in the region, as well as bring the undersea communications where they try to sort of even detect the submarines, as well as the submarine visits to Sri Lanka. So it's sort of a very wider geopolitical context I discuss. And the Indo-Pacific, where Sri Lanka can play a really big role in the Indo-Pacific, where Sri Lanka has played in its past, for example, on a rules-based order, on the law of the sea, its contribution from law of the sea. And it's, back in the past, it's for Indian Ocean Zone for Peace, as well as, so Sri Lanka can be a strong partner with both Indo-Pacific as well as BRI, not limiting to binary, but also working more with the middle powers and strengthening the relationship with India is really important. One of the chapters which I talk about the bombs and election, which has become a bit favorite among the reviewers. I wrote this on 5 cases, taking 5 cases in South Asia. This was the sort of least attention a piece I wrote, but it has captured the audience. I said that there is a connection between the bombs and the elections, because the elections, the bombs are, always, it goes off closer to the election. So I take 5 cases, 2 in India, as well as 3 in Sri Lanka, which is Easter Sunday, which is and 2 presidential races where 1 week apart there's bomb blasts, and then how it affects. Whether it affects the ruling party or whether it's does it affect the opposition party, and how does there is a connection, and also the sympathy, how it works. Where Gotabaya Rajapaksa clearly came in from a national security as a campaign, saying that, look, I am the person to guarantee you the security. So which managed to win the election. So such pieces are also in the book, and so I kind of cover a wider spectrum, and then go on to the local domestic political issues also. So I saw that.
Great, Asanga. Let me 2 very brief questions, rapid fire with you before we move on to Nepal. But one, I really would like to get your take on a very simple question, but I think people sometimes forget. Compared to, say, 20 years ago, 2000, 2020, has the strengthening of Sri Lankan ties with China increased Sri Lankan strategic autonomy? Is today Sri Lanka a more comfortable country in terms of strategic? Does it have more options than it had 20 years ago?
No, I think the Chinese footprint has increased significantly in the island. If you look at the 20 years time, I mean, when the BRI came, as well as the Mahinda Rajapaksa's regime, so from there it has increased significantly, and it would increase more with the their positions have changed. I think we are looking at it from a lens from the past. We need to sort of look at it, how the Chinese, aggressiveness, or how it's sort of a wolf warrior type diplomacy. It's been, you can see from Pompeo's visit to Sri Lanka, it was very clear, where the Chinese embassy replied clearly that, directly replying to the comments of it. So it's more, it's a different China, I would say, in Sri Lanka, and playing a larger role. And Sri Lanka, unfortunately, has lost that balance. So this is what I'm trying to argue in my foreign policy, the chapter on foreign policy, where it has lost the balance, and we're going bandwagoning with China, losing many agreements such as SOFA, MCC, be the LRT of Japan. So the government has not continued of any of those projects, including India's the East Container Terminal. So there have been sort of ban. I see a significant shift towards China, and this would increase. I see an increase, and it would increase in the future.
But so hasn't that strengthened Sri Lankan capacity to diversify its relations? I mean, look at 20 years ago, right? Today you have China taking much more stronger positions, defending Sri Lanka at multilateral institutions, the UN Human Rights Council. You have a China that is supportive in a variety of capacity building, investment, trade initiatives. So does you think Sri Lanka is not as well off as it was 20 years ago, or China hasn't increased the options for Sri Lanka?
China has not increased options for Sri Lanka. China has reduced the options. How I analyzed it, because we have reduced our capacity to work with other countries, while we sort of bandwagon with one particular country. And UNHRC, I don't see it as a victory. I see it as a huge loss. What happened at the UNHRC? So we need to address the minority concerns. We need to be that China and Russia, they're supporting us. You see, projecting as a victory from the foreign ministry. I don't see that as a victory. I think that we need to address these issues. So we have shrunk our space in Sri Lanka. We are limiting to China is not the solution. We need to work with the US, India, as well as many other partners, so including Japan. So we have limited our space. We have moved out. If you keep on borrowing like this, we haven't stopped borrowing. So we keep on 500 million of currency swaps from Ambassador Yang Jeki's visit, another. So we keep on borrowing, but are we using it for the right investments? So we see it as projected as a success, but we are limiting ourselves.
Good. One very quick last question, Asanga, before we move to Nepal. I think your book mentions, interestingly, at some point, the word, two contrasting visions of Sri Lanka in this turbulent, in-between orders world we live in. I think at one point you say Sri Lanka is a prisoner of geography. We are prisoners on this island. At the same point, you also use language saying Sri Lanka is a hub. It is connected. It's at the heart of the Indo-Pacific and the Indian Ocean. Can it be both? Is it one of the, what do you see these days as the island situation of Sri Lanka signifying for the options that Sri Lanka has in terms of its alignments?
That's actually from seeing Sri Lanka as a national security state, where Sri Lanka, because of its geographical position, I bring in the works of Mearsheimer. He says that a country with a long national security state, which is at 30 years of war, and I bring in all these security tensions that have been there. So it becomes an existential threat to the nation, as well as, so you project the country as a serious, geographical position of Sri Lanka has been quoted in the US documents, in the Chinese diplomacy. So it is a known factor. But how best we could use the geographical position is by balancing. There's no way of choosing one side, and we need to sort of balance. So if you lose the balance, there will be instability. coming in, we will be inviting instability. This is the main crux of basically idea of the book. You don't balance, you bring in instability to the domestic politics. And it has happened in the past, it will happen in the future. So prisoners of geography is because you try to sort of use the geography by to make life better in the island. I mean, 70 years gone after independence, so Sri Lanka's per capita is still below 5,000. So we have about 30% of poverty. So we have serious concerns in the society. Why we're like this is also because of a weak, I would say, a foreign policy in place. So we're not sort of balancing. We're supposed to balance, but we rhetorically say we balance. We are balanced, but are we balanced? If you look at the statements after the Human Rights Council saying that, look, it's a Western conspiracy against, no, I don't think so. So this has to be understood by the policy makers as well as the foreign policy establishment.
Right. Thank you, Asanga, on this fabulous note of prison of geography. No better country than Nepal to talk about how geography can be claustrophobic in many ways. If an island can think of itself as a prison and being limited, certainly a landlocked country between two major civilization countries, India and China, has a thing or two to say, or a country that's described as a yam between two boulders, constantly fragile, precarious position. Amish, over to you to tell us a bit about how Nepal has looked at China and this new China emerging across the Himalayas now.
All right. Thank you, Tino, and thank you, CSEP, for having me over. Like Asanga, I think this idea that prisoners of geography, nations being prisoners of geography, is a very interesting one, especially like you said, Tino, with respect to Nepal. Of course, in recent years, there's been a new focus on Nepal's proximity to China because of China's growing ambitions, so-called, let's say, replacing India as a primary political partner. What I do is that I go back a little further and I trace the historical evolution of Nepal's relation with China. And in the 21st century, I argue that the year 2008 is a turning point. That was the year that the Maoists won the first CA elections. And then the Prime Minister, Pushpakamal Dahal Prachanda, went to Beijing Olympics for the closing ceremony. A visit deemed deeply troublesome by the Indian establishment. 2008 was also the year when anti-Beijing Olympic protests broke out in Kathmandu, and China had lost the monarchy as a permanent friend, and it was looking out for partners that could take care of its, let's say, security interests within Nepal, which is essentially curbing down on Tibetan activism. But I also argue that Nepal had long desired Chinese counterbalance to India's holdover politics and its economy. And it goes back right to the day of the Cold War. But the problem was China's own limitations in the Himalayas. This was primarily infrastructural, because of which it was Chinese support to Nepal during the Cold War and after was limited to moral support, to aid projects, but not much more in terms of, let's say, the sort of effect it could have to counterbalance Indian, let's say, presence in Nepal. These limitations could only be overcome in the 21st century when China invested heavily in Tibet in the infrastructure. The Qinghai-Tibet Railway arrived in Tibet, new roads were built. Further to this, in 2013, China, Xi Jinping introduced a new neighborhood policy, which gave the push required to increase connectivity in South Asia among all of neighbors of China, but primarily in South Asia. New networks were developed, there were increased people-to-people exchanges, and there was also a new template for cooperation in South Asia. We then come to the 2015 unofficial Indian blockade, which provided further impetus to Nepal and its leaders to turn to the north. It accelerated the political and economic exchanges with China, and thus sort of created this narrative that, okay, China has arrived in Nepal. However, I argue that the point to remember is also that China became Nepal's immediate neighbor only in 1950. Until then, it was Tibet that was Nepal's primary window to the north. Nepal's exchanges to the north were focused with Tibet. So I look at these histories. I look at how trans-Himalayan trade was conducted in the past, how the arrival of China and Tibet sort of allowed it to come to an end, and how it evolved since the years to come, including in the 21st century. I also look at Cold War histories of balance geopolitical balance from Nepali side, from Kathmandu's perspective, between India and China, India and the US and China, the US and the Soviets. I look at the history of intrigue, of CIA-supported armed revolutions in the Himalaya. And then I look at also the Cultural Revolution and the impact it had on, let's say, the Nepali strain of Maoism. And finally, I arrive at what is Nepal's road ahead, especially in time of geopolitical contest. You have the India-China rivalry growing, you have the US-China rivalry leaving its impact on smaller nations like ours. And I argue that, yes, non-alignment is the way forward, but whether our institutions are capable enough to deliver that, whether we sort of have developed the institutions well enough to pursue on a non-aligned path, I am not so sure about. It's an interesting argument that from the outside world or the outside narrative outside Nepal is that it has grown close to China. It has benefited from the Chinese, let's say, increased influence in South Asia. However, if you speak to Nepali analysts, if you speak to people inside Nepal, the sense is it is all in name, and we haven't really Nepal hasn't really benefited in terms of what it could get from China. So there is a lot more expectation from China in terms of infrastructure development, in terms of the prosperity it can bring, and of course the lessons on economic growth that obviously are there for everyone, pretty much everyone in the global South. So I end my book on this note of I look at what could be the way forward, what China expects out of Nepal, and what Nepal in turn expects out of China, and how these can be resolved in the years to come. Thank you, Tino.
Thank you, Amish. I don't know how you did it, but you summarized 200 pages in these 5 minutes really well. And I think, but let me bring in a bit of the just superb first 3 chapters of your book, in which you travel along the borderlands of Nepal and China. I think you visit Limu, right, towards
Limi,
the northwest.
yeah,
Limi. You go to Mustang, and then you go to Valley, and then to the third, Razuvagadi. I think the third the 3 chapters, or the 3 points you look at. 2 impressions on that I'd like your comments on. One is you actually tell us that those regions are more connected to Tibet, China, whatever you want to call it, right, across, than with Kathmandu, the lowlands of Nepal, and even India. I think at some point you're speaking to someone in Limi saying, to go to Kathmandu, I have to go to China, then to India, or to India down to UP, Bihar, and come up again. I mean, it's just bizarre, the state of connectivity, right? So one is really the transformative power of the Chinese state. It's not the Nepali state, right? It's showing up on the other side. Thousands of Nepalis crossing the borders to get work, to trade, to get educated even, but mostly to work, right? And to trade across the border. So that's the first thing I wanted you to bring up a bit, because I thought those 3 chapters are just fascinating and I learned a lot from them. And the second one is just your thoughts on the concept of equidistance. I'm sure Asanga also has a thing or two to say about this principle of equidistance, right? That you are equally away from India and China. Is that something that should guide Nepali foreign policy? Has it? Does it make sense to you? So a more practical and a slightly more esoteric question for you, Amish.
All right. Thank you, Dino. I think in the first, I'll start from the borderlands. I mean, to me personally as well, they were the most fascinating chapters to write, because I myself learned so much about them, despite being from Pokhara, which is a lot closer to Mustang. I think what we have to remember here is it was only in the 1970s that Nepal actually established some sort of an administrative body to look after these Himalayan borderlands, in terms of the administration. So the Kathmandu administration actually reached these places very, very late. And in some places, they're still absent. Of course, now you have like local municipalities, all of that. But even then, there was a recent report that basically said that in Limi, there were COVID vaccines had not been supplied, and they had been asking for it. And that just showed to me how distant the concept of the borderlands is still to Kathmandu, and how distant its own people feel to, let's say, the center. And I think that is a concern for most states. How the center looks at the periphery, and how the periphery looks at the center and how it reacts to them. And in this sense, it was so interesting to learn that a lot of these places were first connected to Tibet or China than with Nepal. In Mustang, the first road came down from Kerala, which is the pass at the border. And now there's a annual trade fair there. In Humla as well, the first roads came down from Tibet. And I think what this tells us is that the Chinese capacity to transform the Himalaya has never been starker. And because of that, they've, for example, Taklakot or Purang has just developed into this sort of urban, let's say, sort of dream for people living in Humla on this side, or Bajang, or even Bajura, who cross over regularly. They're looking for employment there. They're starting stores there, selling like jackets, things like restaurants. And during the COVID pandemic, we actually saw the impact of that when China closed off its borders. And I believe last week, there was a report that highlighted how difficult it had been for those who had been seeking employment there to go back because the borders were closed. They couldn't go back to the stores. So obviously incomes were affected. And another interesting thing I found in these places, especially in Humla, was that a lot of Nepalis go outside to work as unskilled labor, and they go to West Asia, they go to Southeast Asia, Japan, South Korea. But in Humla, a lot of these people were going to China. In fact, most of the people I met were going to China to work as whether it's labor or to start their own stores. So I thought that concept of how China has arrived as a, let's say, a formidable and a rich neighbor just across the mountains was very, very interesting to how the periphery also looks at Kathmandu. So you're dealing more with China on a daily basis. So you have to, like, let's say, as I mentioned, you have to sort of align yourself with their laws. You can't mess around. You have to be, and those ideas I thought were very interesting in terms of how, let's say, the citizen reacts to these developments. An ordinary citizen of the borderlands reacts to these developments, whether on this side of the border or the other side. Now, as to the second question of equidistance, has it guided Nepali foreign policy? I am not so sure whether post 2015 it has been the case. What has been, although I think that we can go back a few years ago before 2015 to argue that what's been seen is that there is a sense of partisanship that's evident in our leaders. I mean, the simple example is, there are two examples that I can give you. One is Pushpakamal Dahal Prachanda, who became the first Prime Minister of a Republic Nepal. And then he went to Beijing Olympic closing ceremony. India obviously was not very too happy. And then after he tried to fire the army chief, there was, of course, the whole fracas about him not being able to come to power because so-and-so, let's say, there was political management in terms of, like, gathering together an anti-Maoist coalition. And I very clearly remember him saying that this government is an Indian engineered, let's say, government. And, like, basically he was appealing to nationalism, which is, let's say, the common fodder for all Nepali national politicians who are out of power. In 2020, after Kharga Prasad Oli, the current prime minister, he dissolved the parliament, Prachanda reached out in a video interview to India saying India had a moral role to come to assist in Nepali, let's say, the struggle against the dissolution, because it pretty much was responsible for the 2006 movement. And that is the sort of partisanship that is very, very, let's say, immediate in Nepali politics at the moment. And you can see it in the prime minister as well. I mean, during the whole map controversy, he was pretty much saying all sorts of things to India, like, I mean, Ram was born in Nepal and things like that. Like, even if, like, I mean, he's a mythical character, but the sort of the emotional impact of that is obviously a lot especially in India of current times. And then after that, he's suddenly, like, he's found a way out, and he's reached out to India, and India has reached out to him. Just today, there was a talk between the two foreign ministers about COVID diplomacy, about COVID vaccines. So you know that there is always a sort of it's either here or there, depending on how the situation is, in Kathmandu in terms of the political survival. So more than whether Nepali foreign policy has been equidistant, I'll argue that Nepal's political leaders have been partisan, and the foreign policy has been guided by their interests. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, but Amish, one last thing before going to Nilanti. I was puzzled in 2-3 references in your book where you actually say that China today is the primary bilateral relationship of Nepal, that China is the principal relation or partner of Nepal. I'm not sure. You don't think I mean, you document how it is becoming more important, but have we reached that stage really?
See, obviously, I mean, the events of 2020 sort of make us want to, pause and reflect on that statement a little bit more, because China has suffered a setback. But I mean, if you look at it in terms of, let's say, the economic engagements, the investments that China is bringing in or will bring in, even the ones that have been, let's say, pledged, the sort of aid agreements that have happened, even in the bordering districts. China is now will about give, I think, $1 million each to 15 bordering districts in the years to come. And in terms of the political engagement that China had managed even before 2020 and in 2020, as we saw, I think that made it, in a sense, I wanted to argue that, yes, I don't think that India can be replaced on a more, let's say on an economic or a cultural or even a social level. But as a political alternative, I think China is here. And I don't think once a country like China, any global power, has found a space in a country like Nepal, I don't think they're going to cede ground so easily. And that is something that we'll have to, let's say, again, recall or analyze in the days to come, because as you know, the situation is quite fluid right now. And I would say all major bilateral partners in China, India, the US, they've all been relatively quiet on this political fluidity. So we'll still have to see how it develops in the days to come.
Thank you, Amish. Good, let's move back south to Sri Lanka and Nilanti. Your comments and your expert views and insights on Asanga's fabulous book.
Sure. Thanks so much, Tino, and to CSEP for the invitation to participate in this discussion. And really, I'm just grateful for the opportunity to share some of my personal views and to also examine Asanga's really just excellent book. I'll just make 4 points. So really the first is this book provides a lot of unique insights into the formation of Sri Lanka's defense strategy and policy development. That's not something that you often see in English language sources. So the fact that Asanga actually details that process of how Sri Lanka went about developing a national defense policy, I found to be very, very interesting. My second point is really about the threats of terrorism that Sri Lanka has faced and continues to face to this day. I think it's really this discussion is really the strongest contribution of the book. Asanga vividly describes how he has personally been affected by terrorism, tragically, from the loss of his father to an LTTE attack, and then moving forward to the present, the events of the Easter Sunday bombings and how he was at the Shangri-La Hotel with his family. Asanga mentions, and I just mentioned it earlier as well, how the Easter Day bombings, they caused the single largest loss of life in a day due to terrorism in Sri Lanka's history. And I think stepping back, that's a striking figure, because Sri Lanka, when people think about terrorism and Sri Lanka, they think about Sri Lanka's war against the LTTE. And then the focus now is so much on great power competition and China-US competition. But that statement really brings home the reality that the largest casualties that Sri Lanka has incurred in one day is due to neither of those threats. So it really suggests the need for Sri Lanka to devote more attention to this type of security threat that it faced in the Easter Sunday bombing attacks. And Asanga really details the gaps in terms of the intelligence agencies and the insufficient information sharing that took place. And ultimately, Asanga talks about that day as essentially gross national security negligence in his final assessment. So again, I think that discussion throughout the book is really the strongest part of the book. My third point is about the role of the US. I would like to see that more unpacked, and hopefully we can, I would love to hear Asanga's thoughts more in our discussion today. I'm speaking from the US, so I'm curious to know more about that line of argumentation. But essentially, Asanga talks about the US-led liberal hegemony and the US strategy of liberal hegemony. I was curious to know what does that mean when it comes to the manifestation? If that is the US's strategy, then how is that manifested in Sri Lanka on the ground? What are the tangible implications of that? Are we talking about the Sri Lanka and the UN Human Rights Council? There was a reference to liberal hegemony and implementing a regime change strategy. So is that what we're talking about? There was another statement about US liberal hegemonic aspirations in the Indian Ocean region. I didn't find that convincing, just because the US, I would argue, has higher priority theaters than the Indian Ocean. So I would be curious to hear Asanga unpack that argument a little bit more. And then my final point is really taking a step back, having gone through the book, really, to me, what comes across is how many aspects or characteristics that Sri Lanka displays as a small state. And it's really clear when you read the discussion about Sri Lanka's threat perceptions in the wider region. Asanga has a very interesting discussion about the history, about the declaration of the Indian Ocean as a zone of peace, talking about the fears about great powers and their ability to expand their presence in the Indian Ocean. And then he brings the discussion into the present day, where he talks about Sri Lanka's concerns about how the country could end up as a multi-logistics hub operations base for the US and Chinese navies. So bringing that into the contemporary discussion about great power competition. And then he also mentions the Indian hegemon with its overspilling nationalism. So I think taken together, these factors are very indicative of the very challenging security environment that a small state needs to navigate at the neighboring level, with India as a dominant regional player, and then as well as the wider region and global strategic competition when it comes to the US and China. Another point is the use of multilateral institutions by a small state. That was very clear when Asanga was talking about the Indian Ocean Zone of Peace going back to the 70s and the use of the UN General Assembly as a forum that was used by Sri Lanka as a small state as well as others. But essentially, the small states, they will use multilateral institutions as a way of augmenting their capability or their power. Also, taking the discussion again into the present day, Asanga talks about Sri Lanka and its significant role in BIMSTEC. So again, Sri Lanka using its voice as a small state through multilateral institutions as a way of augmenting its power and its capability. So I'll just close by saying I think this book is a very useful contribution to the literature, essentially to have the view of a Sri Lankan expert in the form of a book that can be cited for many years to come. So I think it's a very useful contribution to the literature.
Thank you, Nilanti. Absolutely agreed on, especially on the personal part, striking Asanga, right? How he brings up, you start with the book, literally you sitting, I think, in the hotel, right? And the bombs going and you surviving by a few minutes. And that's why also I think the linkage between internal security and external security comes up all the time in the book. Internal stability, external stability or instability, etc. But Nilanti, one quick question we've coming from a participant, which I think you're very equipped to bring up. It's a question by Donna Kamangara. She's actually asking about the continuity in Indo-Pacific and Quad policies under the Biden administration now, saying that The US has made a renewed commitment to the Indo-Pacific framework under Biden, continuity with Trump and previously particularly with Trump. So no surprise there, or maybe surprise, but continuity. And Quad, of course, we've seen a big Quad summit happening recently. How will that affect Sri Lanka's position? What's your sense? You followed Sri Lanka very closely. Should it surprise Sri Lanka? Should Sri Lanka, does it need to adjust to this? Should it be concerned? Should it adjust? I mean, what's your sense?
It's a good question. I think it's part of a larger historical pattern that Sri Lanka has observed and has had to navigate, essentially, in terms of great powers, essentially using their influence and having to mediate those preferences. It's not in Sri Lanka's interest to pick one great power over another. It's shown throughout since independence how it needs to essentially derive gains or benefits from all of those powers. So that's really been its consistent struggle and approach, is finding the right balance with regard to the various realms, the political realm, diplomatic realm, economic, military realm. So I think with regard to the Quad, I don't think it's a surprise from a US perspective to see continuity in the Indo-Pacific strategy that really transcends administrations. But I think there's also a more fundamental issue. Although it's called the Indo-Pacific strategy, it does focus heavily on the Pacific. And I would argue, I think the Indian Ocean is of secondary importance. So I think to some extent, by implication, that would mean maybe that's not the worst thing if you're Sri Lankan, because there's a lot more contestation going on and much more attention to the Pacific in that equation.
Thank you, Nilanti, for that. So not, at least if you are skeptical about Indo-Pacific and Quad in Sri Lanka, you don't need to worry too much, that's what we're saying, maybe because there are a lot of questions on that. But let's move back to Amish's book and get in Antara's comments on how that Nepal-China relationship is evolving. In particular, I think, Antara, we were talking, or you had mentioned to me that you noticed in the book a lot of Nepali expectations about China. I think Amish brought that up, right? Where's China? Belt and Road investments, many have not come through, in fact, disappointment on many fronts. On the other hand, good stories also of a lot of money flowing in, a lot of projects advancing that had been put to the side for decades, in fact, that the Chinese have pulled off. I'm thinking of the ring road in Kathmandu, Amish. I remember, I've only been to Kathmandu the last 15 years, but right, it was done pretty quickly when things finally went ahead with Chinese support. The Japanese had tried, if I'm not mistaken. There's several other Indian projects. So the Chinese managed to build it. Also, coming to the border issue, sorry, Amish, I'm just fascinating. Again, in your books, you visually tell the reader of these tremendous infrastructure of border, immigration, customs, buildings coming up on the other side, right? I mean, China is ready. The road is paved, the building is there, and then on the Nepali side, you basically have a dirt track often still, right? And you have the bulldozers that are going to build the road linking the periphery to Kathmandu, going to China and coming from China into Nepal to build that road down. Anyway, now, Antara, tell us now what maybe Chinese expectations are about Nepal. I think that's what you wanted to focus on a bit, how China looks at Nepal.
Thank you, Tino. And first, I would like to congratulate Amish on this wonderful book. It throws light on Nepal's history with China since 1950. It tells us about how China has affected the lives of Nepalese since then, and how ordinary Nepalese view of China has been evolving over these years. Amish's book is many things at the same time. It is history. It is an interesting collection of rare personal accounts, anecdotes of people from the region. It has shades of journalistic reportage, and then it has geopolitics. It's all in one. So yeah, so kudos to you for that. Secondly, the extensive field work that he has conducted at some of the remotest part in the Himalayas, that is also one of the most beautiful parts probably of the book. And of course, your style of writing, which is like lucid, interactive, engaging, and which really makes reading the book enjoyable experience. So yeah, so congratulations on all those things. So what Amish has done is like he's tried to steer clear of the popular India first perspective that we have in South Asia, and has also tried to stay away from the from various Western dogmas regarding China. So he has tried to give a Nepali perspective, a rare Nepali perspective on the history of the Himalayas and South Asia. To me, the most fascinating sections of the book is, of course, the story of the Navarres of Kathmandu, the various facets of trans-Himalayan caravan trade, interactions between Navarres and the Tibetans, the controversies over their extraterritorial rights in Lhasa, and the plight of their Tibetan wives and half-Tibetan offsprings. So I mean, all these little known histories about the Himalayan population and how they interacted with each other, I think that makes the most interesting part of this book. In subsequent chapters, we find Amish talking about how various villages on Nepal-China border like Limi and Humla have been benefiting from the Chinese gift of development in nearby Tibet. People from these regions are now living, working in comparatively prosperous Tibetan villages and towns across the border. And for that, all they need to do is to make some compromises, like laying down their faith in Dalai Lama, or promising to abide by the Chinese sensibilities. Then there is another interesting case study of Mustang, a village with a history of Tibetan armed resistance. Although China does not allow local Nepali population here to cross over or to work in Tibet, but allows them to take part in the trade fairs that they organize from time to time to help them to buy Chinese products for their daily use. On the other hand, there is the case study of Rasua, where, according to Amish, the growing proximity between both the countries is best exhibited. So, it has actually turned into, because of Chinese interventions, the region has actually turned into a construction hub, and local Nepalese are somewhat free to move and work in nearby Tibetan towns throughout the year. However, during the COVID time, all these places, all these buzzing border crossings have been abruptly shut down by China, and the reasons given were probably the COVID pandemic. So in all, Amish argues that the prosperity has been percolating through Nepal's northern border, but mostly on the prerogative of the Chinese side, based on its various interests and concerns, with Nepal having little say or bargaining power over it. Subsequent chapters hint about Nepal's insecurities over its asymmetric relationship with China, apprehensions over debt traps, frustration over the slow pace of cooperation, unfulfilled expectations. However, notwithstanding its various concerns, Nepal remains somewhat awestruck at China's prosperity and success. The pace of China's economic development in the last 2 decades, its infrastructure capability, its economic surplus, and its poverty reduction achievements are some of the factors that have absolutely captured Nepalese imagination like never before. What is pervasive throughout the book is Nepal's awe-inspired reverence towards China, as a result of which I think it chooses to overlook China's various diplomatic excesses and seems more accommodative towards its various demands and interests, like cracking down on the Tibetan refugees in Nepal or supporting Chinese narratives on COVID and Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and various other issues. Amish's key argument in the book is that for Nepal, China remains the ultimate ray of hope, which can bring radical economic transformation in Nepal and eventually extricate Nepal from India's economic hold. Thanks to China, Amish argues, Nepal is now dreaming big and dreaming of monorails, better airports, better roads, more connectivity, and of course, the much anticipated train from Tibet. So Amish concludes that from here on, all roads for Nepal is going to lead north. And it is, of course, up to Nepal to ensure a smooth ride. To provide a critique to Amish's argument, I would like to quote Ambassador Shamsharan's review of the book, where he says that, well, waving the China card on India's face might be an easy option in Kathmandu, but a real tilt towards north, as Amish hints in this book, may prove rather counterproductive for Nepal. Amish have already highlighted in the book how China remains much in control of Nepal's northern border. Meanwhile, as per Ambassador Saran, it is only a question of time when India-Nepal border too becomes a hard border over growing concerns regarding Chinese presence in Nepal. So in such a situation where Nepal has lesser control on both its borders, one wonders how that might impact Nepal's prosperity, which is, traditionally dependent on open borders and free passage of people and goods. Other than that, my own research of Chinese language literature on China-Nepal relations suggests that China itself does not want that all roads from Nepal head north. Rather, what it wants is to have Nepal as a gateway for China to South Asian heartland. So there is a disconnect over there, like you rightly mentioned in the book. But overall, I should say that this is a very important book particularly for people in India, because for generations, Indians have grown up with a very different perception of Nepal, with a very different attitude towards Nepali people with whom they have lived together, worked together, and shared very close social cultural ties. But the book is a grim reminder that things may be changing. It acquaints us with the current political atmosphere in Nepal, where to borrow Amish's words, a deep animosity towards India prevails across society and institutions, and where being pro-India is like a negative connotation. So from that perspective, I think the book is quite an eye-opener for me. So I shall stop here, and of course, congratulations, Amish, for this brilliant feat. Thank you.
Thank you, Antara. Really nice perspective on really something that is understudied is how China looks at South Asia, right? Which you're doing, and you're doing it for across the region. And I think Nepal is certainly ground zero to understand how China looks at its own neighbor, right, from the north. Amish, my question from Swati Chola coming in at Jindal University, and she really gives you congratulations for a wonderful book, engaging book, but she's sort of questioning this dichotomy you make between political relations on the one hand and economic, cultural, religious, social ties on the other. And somehow stressing that pre-modern, early modern, historically Nepal-China relations were not really political, and only since the 50s, basically, you have the PRC emerging and this political modern history showing up. And she just wants you to sort of debate that a little bit, and then also therefore related, if it's possible to understand China beyond the Tibetan lens, right? How viable is it in this current geopolitical climate with what's happening in the neighborhood, Myanmar, Xinjiang? Can Nepal sort of just look the other way and look beyond Tibet to Beijing?
Thank you, Swati. I think as to the first question about pre-modern and early modern relations between Nepal and China were primarily not political. Here I'm referring to how relations or contacts between China, which is with the many Chinese dynasties before, let's say, the Qings, or even during the Qings, until about 1750, when Nepal was still, the modern state of Nepal had not arisen, and it was only after that when the Gorkha Shahs went on this military expansion, that Nepal as this modern state emerged. And the argument I make is that yes, there were relations between China and Nepal. I mean, you had Orniko, who is a 13th century, let's say, sculpture architect traveling all the way to Kublai Khan's court. You had Tang generals taking Tibetan and Nepali assistants to defeat Indian kings. But it was a sort of a broken, not broken, but an interrupted relationship where till historian Matthew Mosca writes that till the 1792 war, the Qings were not fully aware that the Gorkhas now ruled in Kathmandu. So the point I make is that yes, there was contact, yes, there was exchanges, but can they be called political in nature? I am not so sure. I mean, I could be, Swati, coming from a historian's perspective, obviously everything is, at the end of the day, it is associated with the political, but as to how they shaped the relations between Nepal and China, I don't think politics had much of a part to play in that. As to the second question about understanding China beyond the Tibetan lens, I think especially this is a question. This is an interesting question because obviously when I go on to, let's say, contradict myself within the book as well, because I obviously focus a lot on the Tibetan question and how Nepal's relations with Tibet were like. But I think as to how viable it is in the current geopolitical climate, for let's say about a decade, the Tibetan question was not even on our radars, and we were not talking about it. And it's coming back again simply because there's a new, let's say, rivalry with China going up. But till the time, let's say, China was, growing, and everyone, the US, India, all of them were partaking of this economic relationship, the Tibetan question had vanished. But it was still very much alive in Nepal, except that it was being suppressed. It was no longer discussed. And I think that's the point. That the point is that yes, looking at China from the Tibetan lens obviously affects the view. But even if there is a case to be made to look at China beyond these factors as well, beyond how, let's say, China treats its minority regions, and beyond and to how Beijing, or let's say Kunming or Chengdu, interact directly with other capitals or cities. So that is I hope that answers Swati's question.
Thanks, Amish. Question from Pasang Dorji, who's a member of parliament in Bhutan. For you, Amish, he really wants you to think of very clear reasons why Nepal should turn to China more than it is currently. What are the main reasons? Sort of, he's asking for three, but maybe if you can just give us one main important reason. What is the main reason for you of why Nepal must accelerate its outreach to China?
I won't say why, why Nepal must accelerate its turn to China. What I will argue is, or rather what I'll say is that Nepal's turn is obviously motivated by a variety of factors. The most recent factor being this, let's say, the intractable sort of political and economic hold Nepali leaders, the Kathmandu establishment, and the country was feeling post the 2015 unofficial blockade. And I think that's an important reason to understand the sort of the difference between 2015 and 1989 blockade, again, the Indian blockade in Nepal, is very, very interesting to me, because at that time as well, China had provided moral support. China had said that, okay, this is not the right way to go about things, and equal rights. But at that time in 1989, because of China's own limitations, it couldn't do much. In fact, it told one of a Nepali diplomat that to expedite, let's say, road connections between Tibet and Nepal. But in 2015, it was a very different China that Nepal sort of faced, like when Nepali leaders like Olis decided to look to the north, it faced a China that was willing to send petroleum trucks, even if they were symbolic, 10, 12 petroleum trucks wasn't really going to solve the issue. But it was more of a symbolic gesture that the northern borders were open, that the trade was possible. It was possible to economically de-link Nepal from India. And I think that's been one of the major reasons in recent years for Nepali leaders, Nepali population to look to China.
Amish, one last thing for you, several questions that relate to the importance of different governments and regimes. Nepal is a young democracy, a returned democracy. It's a revived democracy. Its constitution is just a few years old. It's a federal constitution. It's a very progressive constitution. It's a very important, young, vibrant political moment for your country. But here you go, clamping down on the Tibetans. Donald Camp is asking that from the US, actually, question, how is this affecting the relations with the Tibetans? You know the answer, you give it in your book, you say it quite openly, that there's been a continuous crackdown on the Tibetans since 2005. In fact, since King Gyanendra, who first closes the office, and just now a continuous control. You have a whole chapter on the the old Mustang warriors in Pokhara, right, who are saying we can't even buy land anymore, we're stateless, etc. So that's one conclusion you come to. Investments. Antara mentioned this in her, I think, question. Nepal energy minister asking the Chinese ambassador, and you quote him, where are Chinese companies? You've been performing so well in other countries. What are you doing for my country? Where are your investments? Have not arrived. Third, politics. You have the Chinese ambassador these days ferrying around your capital, interfering left and right in the political democratic of your young democracy, right? So if you could comment a bit on these sort of big drawbacks of what China is bringing into. In fact, you alert in this book all the time that we are a very fragile state, and we're just being, being taken for a ride in some ways, and too fragile in terms of being able to negotiate with China.
I think I'll just I can't agree with you on that. The Nepali constitution is a progressive one. I'll have to disagree with you on that. With particularly with Tibet, as I've mentioned, I think the key question is. There's a very interesting line that interesting thing that someone said to me was, don't forget thousands of years of history for 60 years of friendship. And I think that's what's happening in recent years. It's been a sort of for Tibetan, yes, foreign nationals aren't allowed to engage in any political activity in Nepal, but the more important thing for me is the lack of identification and of refugee certificates, as they are called. And I think that when you go to these these Tibetan camps, you get a sense of desolation. I mean, you know that okay, things are not right, but at the same time, you don't hear anything about them in the media. You don't hear anything about them. Generally, as I said, the 2014 Human Rights Watch report was the last serious study on Tibetan refugees in Nepal, and since then there has been nothing. And I think this will continue in the days to come. I doubt that there will be any Tibetan activity in terms of political activity in Nepal in the future. Even if there will be heavily clamped down on. There is a new focus because of the new Tibet Policy and Support Act that gives around $6 million a year to Tibetan communities in India and Nepal. It'll be interesting to see how that, let's say, translates itself to the ground.
But Amish, beyond the Tibetan issue, the larger question is a greater Chinese presence endangering, weakening, slowing down the democratization of Nepal and the independence of this political entity called Nepal?
I don't know whether it's endangering. I cannot say that with like confirmation. I cannot. But one thing's what's certainly noticeable is that China's arrival or China's political presence and influence has allowed Nepal to go on to take certain autocratic measures that it may not have done so in the past. And one excellent example of this is Prime Minister Oli's preference for ordinances and his capture of state institutions. The situation that we are in with Chinese presence right now is a little bit it resembles a little bit of how you sort of imagine, let's say a developing country with its own institutions that are sort of like trying to come up, but suddenly you have this new neighbor who's willing to pump in money, who's willing to bring in lots of engagements without looking at, I mean, in a post-conflict like Nepal, post-conflict society like Nepal, anything to do with human rights, anything to do with individual rights. So it will obviously affect those matters as well. As to whether, in terms of the sort of limitations it will have in terms of diplomatic choices, in terms of security choices, I can't go beyond that, I think, at the moment right now. Because like I said, the situation is pretty fluid. And you know pretty well, in Nepal, I mean, things change within like a year, within like 3 years. So
no, by the way, the progressive constitution was a trap for you. I wanted to hear you say that. And we won't into the Madhesh and the Varja constitutional issues of Nepal, but I note your response. And on connectivity, though, I do think your book doesn't bring on the democracy aspect so much. You talk about economics, culture, society, connectivity, linkages. And I just find it, that's something that really needs to be tracked closely, right? How are these great powers affecting the political choices of Sri Lanka? Let's move south again, Asanga, and let's spend some time on Sri Lanka now. You've heard Nilanti give excellent comments, but there's really, I'll just try to summarize these various questions flooding our inbox. And there's basically two categories of questions for you, Asanga. There's one question, one set of questions, probably best defined by Aisha Pereira, for example. She says, hasn't, really the Rajapaksa tilt towards China over the last 10 years led Sri Lanka into a dependency with China, into a debt trap? Whether the Hambantota deal to lease out the port for 99 years, but she's asking that question. Then you have someone else, an anonymous speaker, putting up in a 3 very nice cogent paragraphs the exact opposite narrative, saying China is the most steadfast and trustworthy partner of Sri Lanka today. It's the only country that has delivered and has not put up strings, not interfered, not conditioned Sri Lanka, and isn't therefore all this other language about debt trap, just basically fear-mongering by other countries that have lost their traditional monopoly or influence in Sri Lanka. What are your views? Where do you stand on these two sides, Asanga?
I think, thank you so much. First of all, thank you, Nilanti. I really appreciate your review and all the points. I mean, on the national defense policy, as well as all of the things that you captured. So thank you very much for the review. And also the liberal hegemonic point, why I bring this is from the work of Stephen Walt. And how it, if you look at even last few weeks ago in Anchorage in Alaska, what really happened was the Chinese party, Wang Yi, questioning you are on the liberal hegemony. Basically, we are not there to listen to you. I mean, that whole conversation, which is on the website of the State Department, is about that. Why I try to sort of bring that into the Sri Lankan narrative is that the US projects such as the MCC, which is highly politicized, using this narrative saying it affects the sovereignty, it affects the national security, which is not true, which is absolutely not true. And so these are all, I think it has to be clearly understood. So why I bring the buck passing of Masham is also basically you bring the buck, more buck passing is better for the region to have more stability. That's what I'm saying. So it's better to have a region, a stable region. You need the US presence, and it's really important. And so to have a balance of it. So quickly going to the question, the two tangents, I mean, of these questions, is there basically a debt trap, I mean, dependency? Yes, there is clearly a China dependency that's going on. I mean, you could see the amount of the borrowings. We try to justify some of the scholars saying that, look, the quantity is smaller, our sovereign bonds are much more, our commercial loans are much more. No, that's not the question. It's about the opaqueness. Why isn't the flights coming to Matala? Why isn't many ships coming? It's about the business model. It's about if there is returns on these projects. If there is no returns, I bring a question on civil military. Is there a sort of a civil military some sort of a window of opportunity for China to bring in a military sort of angle into the island? We say we don't give the ports, but do we have sort of the capacity, the financial or the economic capacity to, why isn't any of the Chinese projects being investigated? Why is it only limited for the election campaigns, saying that we will investigate, we will block? I mean, it was certain projects were blocked, but no one was prosecuted, no one was investigated. Why? I bring in the other countries also of the BRI and then sort of discuss this. So to answer the two, the diverse views, yes, there is a clear Chinese strong foothold in Sri Lanka. It has changed to a more aggressive path with the recent activities. I assess the COVID environment, how it has affected democracy, how the majoritarian community has put up a new model. I sort of bring in a new model saying that, look, it's a kind of a unique model where military where a stronger state with military, I'm not comparing to Pakistan or Myanmar, but a new model, but it's accepted by the majoritarian the polity of the country. So these are kind of very, serious warnings that I also draw in the book clearly, that are you going to sort of for example, the last conversation with President Xi and Gotabaya on the 29th of March, the phone conversation where President Gotabaya says that we would like to follow the economic model of China. We would like to bring in the economic model of China. So where again, Basil Rajapaksa says that the CCP model is the way forward. I mean, these are serious comments. And my worry is that, while you have the political environments that it could sort of, move towards losing that democratic space that we have on transparency, on accountability, and many other areas. So you have to have a balance in here. And it's really, really important to have that balance. So I don't see that balance right now.
Asanga, a question from Savitri Selaperumage. She's asking, could we think of a Sri Lanka more involved with the Quad, for example? The Quad is becoming much more flexible now. You had a meeting last year with Vietnam, New Zealand, South Korea, the Quad Plus, Quad Plus Plus. So imagine there's something maybe on HADR, or is that something you would see as possible in the near future?
Thank you, Savitri. Yes, that's the excellent question. So, I mean, when you're looking at the Quad right now from a Sri Lankan perspective, how would sort of Sri Lanka support it? And I have written about the Quad clearly, and how Sri Lanka should join hands with India. And I mean, on the equidistance, the previous question which you raised, I again bring it to discussion and say, we cannot be equidistant because we are too close to India. So I clearly answer that geographically we are close. So you can only have equidistance if you have sort of close in distance, but then yes, a balanced position. When it comes to the Quad, very, very important that you bring in the Quad because of the aggressive Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean. I've clearly put up that the map, which is what's happening undersea. I bring in the submarine concerns, the maritime concerns in the Indian Ocean, how nations like Maldives or Mauritius or Sri Lanka can easily sort of drift towards the Chinese orbit if there is no the Quad mechanism. I bring in the work of George F. Kennan on the containment, how that was important back then, and how it's going to be difficult right now because the Indo-Pacific is a larger geography you're looking at. It's not a close sort of like European, continent where you can easily sort of, navigate. But here it's quite different. The geographic challenge will be there, as well as China is a completely a different. It is not. I mean, we see it as a Cold War emerging, but then yes, but it's a completely different strategy. Completely. Being with the Indo-Pacific, where I bring in works of David Brewster, where he sort of, David questions India, saying, does India have the capacity to be the net security provider in the Indian Ocean? So an Australian perspective and Sri Lanka to work with a lot of middle powers like Japan, Australia, and many other countries, being in that geostrategic location. So that's the solution that I put forward.
But exactly on this point on middle powers, Asanga, in Nepal, again, we've discussed it with Amish, but in Sri Lanka too, right? Sri Lanka had to diversify and balance. I think your book makes it quite obvious that you don't want to rely only on China, US, India even, right? But recent developments have been quite worrisome. I think there's one country that follows pretty transparent connectivity infrastructure processes. It's the Japanese, right? And they're facing the heat in Sri Lanka these days. And just your comments on that. I mean, is that how do you see that? Is there really a pushback against Japan and other countries? Is it total China dependence, or what's happening with it? And by the way, the European Union too is facing this, right? The European Union, European countries are also facing a lot of pushback in Sri Lanka these days.
I think that question, if you had to look at it from post UNHRC as well as the pre-UNHRC, the position has completely changed. The shifts are quite strong, as well as the dynamics are really, it happens very fast in Sri Lanka. You can't even capture, I mean, what really happens. For example, after the UNHRC resolution, you have a complete shift saying that it's a Western conspiracy. We are with our friends, China, strongly making statements from foreign minister, foreign secretary, and also the president. I was surprised to see that on the devolution, saying that, you know, they're trying to creeping the devolution in to the country. No, that's incorrect. Devolution, we've been talking for the last 30 years in this country, and minority concerns, we've been talking about it for a long time, and it has not been addressed. And this is a serious issue. The reason why countries like Japan or European Union sort of, you know, doesn't get affected by this is because they're not adequately addressed properly, the minority concerns, especially European Union. But in Japan, the LRT, the projects that Japan had was sort of suspended, and then they're renegotiating. And so from regime to regime, most of the decisions are sort of reset, and they try to recalibrate things. So there is no coherent or consistent policy. So that affects the relationship with Japan, or even with China, saying that we are going to relook at the Hambantota, the 99-year lease. So that affected China. In the recent comment made by the chairman of the port, saying that we are going to relook at it again. But there is no, I don't see any provisions of relooking at it, or there is no progress. It's just saying it, to make it just a rhetoric statement. So here, I think what happens is the investment portfolio, it affects the economy, because you don't have a consistent policy on any of these projects. As also, if, for example, India was a clear example. From East Container Terminal, you switch to the West Container Terminal. And then while the trade unions start speaking geopolitics for the first time, the entire port operation was stopped. And the port operation was completely stopped by the union, saying that it cannot be given to India. And then a switch happens from east to west. So at the same cabinet meeting, a wind project was, they tried to give it to, closer to the island, Sri Lanka and India, an island wind project to China. So you see all these dynamics happening at the same time, and it's not going in the I would say not in the right direction. Even with Japan, their concerns, even with the European Union or with the other Western countries, you cannot see the UNHRC or the reconciliation process, which Sri Lanka needs a genuine reconciliation process. It's been 12 years after the war. I myself, being a victim, direct victim, I'm ready to reconcile. I'm ready to work forward, and so there are many others who wants to, to work towards some sort of progressive path, rather than you talk about it for so many years. But you cannot reconcile or talk reconciliation in a selective manner. This is where the problem is. So, for example, when one member of parliament, the Tamilian, who visits a mother of a, LTTE, former LTT, her son was a LTT fighter. So him visiting the house and lighting a candle, you cannot see it as against the the whole society or against. So you need to come out of that. And if terrorists can, there are terrorists who've been who's in the parliament, for example, like from the northern province, there are former combatants who are now as member of parliament. So if that can happen, then the rest also can happen. So the selective approach cannot happen. And you need to work with these countries, European Union, Japan, many other countries, India especially.
Asanga, recently the External Affairs Minister of India, for example, was in Colombo and said there's a clear expectation that Sri Lanka should still adopt the 13th Amendment, right, and push for devolution. How was that received by the current regime in Colombo?
Well, that's why I mentioned earlier, I was shocked to see that statement by the president. I mean, it's on the 13th Amendment, saying that that there's devolution behind the UNHRC. There is no they're trying to creep in because the government with its ultra-nationalist, political mandate, and trying to sort of weaponize the narrative of what is the outcome of the UNHRC in there to gain a political gain. So it's not going forward. You don't see any. For example, the Provincial Council Minister, Admiral Sarath Veerasekara, who clearly mentioned that no, he's not ready for devolution, and he doesn't believe in devolution. So you have a minister who's representing the Provincial Council who doesn't believe devolution. So this is something that we have worked for 30 years. Some say it's inefficient. It's inefficient because of corruption. So you allow corruption to come into provincial councils. They have made it inefficient. So you need to sort of make it efficient and see it as a positive way forward, because minority concerns, if you look at now there is a concern in Jaffna right now, where the mayor was arrested apparently. So there are concerns in the Eastern Province, so the provincial concerns, we need to come out of the past also, like, provincial council, maybe think of it as looking at it like economic councils for Jaffna, economic councils for the East, economic council for the South, because it's been 30 years we've been discussing this. And more sort of, and it has been heavily politicized, so I don't see anything moving forward right now, unfortunately.
Thanks, Asanga. Nilanthi, if I may come to you, you were part recently of a group at the U.S. Institute of Peace, I think, on China and smaller states of South Asia. But I think one question that comes up here that relates maybe to that report, you could share a bit from Anu Anwar, is that suggesting there's a bit of a great power obsession with great power games in South Asia, the Chinese, the Indians, the Americans, everyone sort of using Nepal and Sri Lanka as their stomping ground, and the grass really suffers in the end, and it's sort of just a witness, right? Even if they make love with each other, to look at Lee Kuan Yew, I think you use that you paraphrase them in your book, Asanga. So all these states are quite worried, but Anu Anwar, I think, is saying at the same time, don't these states really have agency and capabilities to read the system, take decisions, balance one away the other? Aren't we seeing quite sophisticated, interesting behavior in these countries?
Yes, absolutely. Small states, they have agency. I think that is often forgotten when observers try to interpret the actions by small states, particularly the smaller South Asian states, through an India-China prism or a US-China prism. Those states certainly have the ability to conduct their own foreign affairs. So I think, yes, I agree with Anu, and it's good to thank you, Anu, for the question. Good to hear from you. Yes, but at the same time, small states also have responsibilities and should really own them as well. I think in the case of Sri Lanka, we're seeing now the ramifications of decades of really poor economic management. There's a lot of discussion about the Chinese debt trap, but I think of it more broadly. It really is a manifestation of the middle income trap, where you have for decades, Sri Lankans really became accustomed to receiving concessional financing, and it's just been a process of, as the country has grown in terms of its economic status, it's had to lose that concessional financing, but there's been an inability to adjust to that new external environment. So as a result, I think Sri Lanka, it's difficult because it's hard to navigate certainly that external security environment. But Sri Lanka definitely has agency, and I think has not yet successfully updated its debt management strategies. So we're seeing the consequences of that with regard to, especially now after COVID. COVID's been a factor that has only exacerbated Sri Lanka's economic circumstances. Right, looking now as China as sort of that provider, it's certainly concerning, the path that Sri Lanka appears to be on. But I do think, though, in terms of its foreign policy and its defense policy, its relationship with India is much more solid, and I think often gets overlooked how strong Sri Lanka's defense and security ties are with India. For example, Sri Lanka does not have a regular naval exercise with China, like it has many different levels of engagement with the Indian security establishment. And that's just one example. So I think that's often forgotten because so much attention is on to Sri Lanka's relationship with China. But yeah, small states definitely have agency, but they also have responsibilities. And that's really when it comes down to the strengthening internally and to enhance and undergird domestic stability, because you have consequences externally, implications externally when you have a faltering internal base, as we're seeing now, unfortunately, with Sri Lanka's economy.
Nilanti, just going back to the initial point about the U.S. role in all this, I'm sure you're familiar with the phrase "too many cooks spoil a broth," right? Sometimes too much involvement by too many actors can lead to instability, competition, and weaken these countries and put too much pressure on them. If you could tell us a bit how Washington thinks about this, like, should we do more alone in the Sri Lanka or Nepal without India? Should we coordinate more with India? Is India just difficult or actually cooperating? Because if I go to Kathmandu and I see the most amazing narratives about whatever India does, it's because of the US. So whatever US does in Kathmandu, it's because of India. You go to Colombo, I'm sure Asanga can tell us many stories about whatever the US does in Sri Lanka, it's because it's actually pushed by India, or vice versa. The US is outsourcing its policy to India. Your comments on that outsourcing narratives?
It's a really good question, Tino. Again, I think it's often interpreting actions taken at the domestic level and interpreting it through some sort of regional or great power framework. But I think it is worth noting, though, that there has been a transformation in U.S.-India ties really over the past decade, certainly over the last several years, whereas when the U.S. would try to conduct relations with the smaller South Asian countries, India would sometimes pose quite an obstacle to U.S. interests and ambitions with regard to conducting its own bilateral relationships with the smaller South Asian states, including Sri Lanka. So I think that environment has changed just due to the advances in the US-India bilateral relationship. And as a result, those two countries appear to be coordinating much more and information sharing much more when it comes to regional policy. So we've really seen that a lot in terms of the interactions between US officials and Indian officials. And then another factor that has helped advance that are the shared threat perceptions of China, particularly with regard to the events on the border over the past year. So that security relationship is only tightening, and that has helped in terms of, I think, India is not the obstacle to the US in the smaller South Asian countries that it used to be. I think that's definitely a significant development.
Thanks, Nilanti. And I think these various defense agreements are fascinating material to be looked at, right? There was an alleged Indian defense agreement with the Maldives recently leaked, denounced as fake by the Maldivian government, but looked quite familiar to me in terms of many of the agreements the US had signed with India, and the US had tried with Sri Lanka, and any great power, by the way, trying to, expand its military capabilities will have to sign sooner or later. The Chinese have done the same in one way or the other, including Djibouti. So that's fascinating material to be looked at. But Antara, let's look at it from the other way, from China. You were doing recently a bit of an analysis how Chinese strategists and thinkers look at South Asian countries, and you've mentioned this interesting concept called immature democracies, sort of young, infantile, chaotic democracies, which is a tautology because that's what democracies are. They're just, the governments change, there's public opinion, there's a lot of noise. That's probably something China's not used to deal with. at least with South Asian intractable democracies and difficult. So is China also getting entangled sometimes in these democratic issues in these countries? Does it see it as an irritant for its relations? Because what you hear often from China is, we want stability, we want a unified communist party in Nepal, we want one solid, Rajapaksa group party, whatever you want to call it, in that we can deal with in the long term in Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Tino, for the question. As you know, China's experience in South Asia for the last few years is far from smooth sailing. And one of the factors that have deeply frustrated, deeply disturbed the Chinese side is the perennial cycle of suspension, cancellation, and price rise for Chinese projects in the South Asian countries. And the Chinese side precisely blame it on what they call the immature democracies of South Asia, with an unstable, polarized, and fragmented political environment, which is topped by a complex religious, ethnic, and cultural setting. They often argue that on one hand, the divided political situation in South Asia, it gives India an undue advantage in interfering or influencing the affairs in the region. On the other hand, the China-India competition itself becomes a tool in the hands of all these South Asian countries to raise objections, to negotiate, to renegotiate, and bargain hard with Beijing, which kind of raises the cost of Chinese operations in South Asia. So even as China officially brags about its very close relations with various South Asian countries, you have phrases like higher than mountains, sweeter than honey for China, Pakistan, or you have brothers looking out for each other, as Amish has mentioned in his book about China-Nepal relations. But if you look at the domestic debates and discussions in China, you can see Chinese scholars saying that, so the politicians, the political class in South Asian countries will be like, they're just looking for opportunity to pounce on China's riches. So, they are quite bothered about this issue, and the political landscape in South Asia is one of the factors that deeply disturbs the Chinese side. Yeah.
Thank you, Anta. That's fascinating. I really look forward to see more of that in your writings, because it tells us also that, like you said, it's not smooth sailing. It's been a difficult process. And for a country that is an autocratic one-party state, it is obviously puzzling and irritating, I think you used that word, to deal with constant regime change. In fact, that's one question also we had gotten from Sanju Gurung, who was asking, is the constant governmental political change in these countries affecting the foreign policies of these countries, right? So these countries themselves often, Sangha, you bring it up in your book all the time, right? You speak with pain and with criticism about the erosion of long-term strategic Sri Lankan thinking. That's at least the argument you make repeatedly, whether it's on national security, defense policy, foreign policy. Amish, your book is full of examples for everyone who's saying that you're making an example that China is wonderful. No, you keep warning in your book that Nepal is not equipped. It's going for these deals and actually not looking into the horse's mouth, and it's coming off poorer sometimes, right? Or disappointed, right? And to play at a greater level, you need greater, sharper instruments, and Nepal needs them for sure. Because to say just we want to balance and be equidistant are all beautiful words, but if governments change every year in Nepal, right, nothing's going to change. So I think we'll have to end very soon, but we've spoken a lot about China, a lot about the US, and Ilanti and Anta have done a fabulous job in bringing that larger angle. We've spoken a bit about Japan also. Australia's come up, the Europeans, but I want to end on India, if you allow me, even though we've spoken a lot about China, because this is really the immediate relationship for both these countries, and traditionally still the most important relationship. Amish, on your perspective on the book, you downplay something that is very important to me, connectivity. And you say, yeah, India's doing some things on infrastructure in the borderlands. There's been a few roads and rails and new border posts. Asanga, you bring it up a lot that India has responded more, but you actually say India needs to do much more. I think that comes up 2 or 3 times in your book that India needs to up its game in Sri Lanka and recalibrate this relation. I think upping its game means basically interdependence. I'm thinking of the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement that was signed in 2003, the product actually of 2 main negotiators, 2 people that were influential at that point, Ambassador Shivshanka Menon, who had been High Commissioner to Colombo in 1999, I think, onwards, and then also our president of CSEP, Rakesh Mohan, was influential also in crafting many of these economic agreements. That's a 2004 agreement. It's been now revised for 4 or 5 years, has not seen the light of day. There's no progress on that. So both of you are skeptical about it, but I'd want to know from you what your comments are on the following statement. Has China actually done India a great favor by waking up India to the importance of fleshing out much more connectivity, interdependence, and rethinking its relations with Nepal and Sri Lanka? Do you see in Kathmandu and Colombo a new India emerging, or is it all just talk and it's the same India we saw 15, 20 years ago? Maybe Amish, we'll start with you.
I'll say, so far from what we've seen in 2020 and 2021, yes. I think China has done India a favor. I believe it was the Norwegian historian Ordan Westad who said that to compete with China, you cannot do it on the cheap, and India obviously needs to accelerate its own projects in Nepal, development projects in Nepal that had been lingering for a long time. And post 2015, we've seen, and you've also argued this, that India has accelerated its pace of construction. And let's say we can see that in the Amlekanj pipeline. We can see that in the new oil pipeline that's coming in from Eastern Nepal, in a way, sort of decoupling the whole idea of petroleum linkage from India itself. India has invested a lot in post-earthquake reconstruction, and the Kathmandu-Raxaul railway is moving ahead much, much quicker than expected. And there were recent reports that India might be willing to pay for the entire Kathmandu-Raxaul railway. If it does so, I think that will certainly be a game changer in many, many ways. I mean, the entire thing right now is one of the critiques of India in Nepal is also that the aid projects that it promises do not deliver. And I think if it's shown that, okay, India can deliver on the projects that it has committed to, perhaps even better than China, quicker than China, I think the narrative certainly can change.
And has it changed, Amish? What's the sense in Kathmandu today? Tell me, you followed this for the last 20 years. You give us a sense of how people in Nepal are thinking. A lot of anti-India feeling, we know all of that. That's normal in these neighborhoods.
Yeah, I think it'll still take a while to completely permeate to the local, let's say the individual level, the general public level, because obviously, like I say in the book, Nepal's politicians themselves often encourage such sort of belief and ideas. But I think on the whole, in the last 5 or 6 years or so, I think India has, after the 2015 blockade, that is, India has become quieter on the political front. It has engaged a lot more on the connectivity side, on the economic side. It has shown that it is willing to engage beyond, say, just the political side of things, which is what the traditional complaint or the traditional belief that India always, that Nepalis always have with India. And I think that's a very, very interesting progression of how, let's say, there's been a course correction in many ways. Whether as to it has permeated to the local level, it still remains to be seen. But like I said, if this Kathmandu-Raxaul railway moves ahead in the next 2 to 3 years, I believe it'll be a game changer.
Thank you, Amish, and I look forward to your book, All Roads Lead South, which will be literally the mirror image of this book. I was reading these chapters and I was saying, this would be a great chapter on Janakpur. This would be a great chapter on Raxaul and the border and what's happening there. And this would be a great chapter on the history. I think someone should write that book, and probably you again best positioned to do that. Asanga, over to you to this question about what if the perception about India has changed, and also has India changed its approach to Sri Lanka, and what could it do more from your perspective?
Well, the perception has, I would say, changed quite a lot. I mean, with the new regime. Well, it's a regime that's been one of the key areas that India is focused is about the devolution of power. So the regime is not ready to sort of accommodate it or talk about it. And my worry is that even the PCOI report, the Presidential Commission report, and how much will it be politicized to a degree that an external nation getting engaged or involved in? I mean, you can get into really dangerous areas. While the question is, been raised that who is behind. So there are a lot of negative sentiments. Although India, steps ahead to assist Sri Lanka and many other countries in the region, it needs to be sort of received. And my sort of analysis in the book is to India to step up more, much more, due to the factors that the importance of sustaining the democratic fabric of Sri Lanka, to working on with the regional councils, working whatever we had. The new models that have been spoken about are still experimented in those particular countries. I mean, China, I'm talking about. Even the Chinese model is an experiment that's going on. So I think it's really, really important to sort of understand the India's role in the region, as well as accommodating India to a degree that sort of we can balance things off in Sri Lanka. And India could get involved much more. But like you mentioned about the trade agreement, which is from a long time back, we've been talking about it. That's because of the inward, I would say, malign mercantilist sort of practices by some, I would say in the policy circle that you have, that even a free trade agreement with Singapore, which was signed, was never sort of not been activated. There are many others that Sri Lanka can benefit immensely, but if you're looking at it in a very inward, sort of economics perspective, so you are not going ahead. Because if you look at that India trade agreement saying that, look, Indians are going to flood this market and Indians are going to come in and take over certain businesses. So these are concerns of that's been heavily politicized and been spoken about. And the same thing was done to the Singapore FTA, saying there's no benefits. And so if you go in that that trajectory, the country is going to lose a lot of opportunity. It's the same way that we lost a huge grant from the USAID, the 480 million grant. It was heavily politicized, saying that from Colombo to Trincomalee, there is going to be one division road, and the US invasion, and all these things came up. But then it is very unfortunate, and even a commission was appointed, and the commission found it that no, they are not going to go forward from the government. So I think India's role is really important for a country like Sri Lanka, situated in the Indian Ocean, who sort of can get engaged in maritime security much more, HADR operations. Sri Lanka can play an immense role. Even like European Union, which they, the certain projects that they have in the Western Indian Ocean, you can sort of, Sri Lanka in the middle, sort of, can bring in a lot of, on the maritime security part. So there are a lot of things that Sri Lanka could do, but India needs to step up much more. And rather than, the last visit of Minister Shivshanka, where he says that he was very honest when he said, when he made that statement, saying that, look, the devolution is important and we need to at least speak about it. But there's nothing coming out of the devolution, because or talking about the devolution. So the narrative here is that it has been forced by India, so which is absolutely wrong, and it was never forced. It was something that we wanted, and so if the government keep projecting that, the narrative, or the other political parties, so it's absolutely, you're going in a different direction. So Sri Lanka would need to take a more progressive path.
Thanks. And I think you speak also to the dilemma in India in terms of what can India do to get closer to Sri Lanka, right? You have a security track. You mentioned the not so innovative India, Sri Lanka, Maldives security alignment, which started actually 2011 or 12, if I'm not mistaken, and was revived recently. It was then put on hold. So that's on the security front, so much happening on maritime security, right? On naval cooperation, intelligence sharing, right? You mentioned in your book how Sri Lanka got a call the morning of the Easter attacks, right? From India, warning clear inputs about what was about to happen. So that's going well. That's a security track. And also the economic connectivity one, right? I think after 40 years or 30 years, for the first time, a plane landed in the Jaffna airport, right? Which had been renovated in northern Sri Lanka with an Indian grant. I remember 2015 or 16 taking the railway all the way from Colombo to Jaffna, built within the Indian economic assistance package. Reconstruction, relief, energy, the possibility of an electricity grid, and then a whole sort of services and trade discussion we just mentioned. I think on all those, there's a lot happening, and that's probably the Indian dilemma, but up in Sri Lanka, certainly watching closely that Indian debate too. So I want to thank all of you. I think we could go on and on and on. And Asanga, I won't ask you for another book because you write a book every 2 years. We all have much to learn from you, I for sure. And I'm sure something is already in the making. Maybe a good India-Sri Lanka book, a la Amish Mulmi. I think sort of a good bilateral story would be fascinating, how Sri Lanka looks at India. It was not a coincidence that I tweeted today about your third Prime Minister, Kotelavala, who actually says that the India-Sri Lanka relation, India-Ceylon relations, he's writing in 56, is akin to the England-Europe relation. In your book, you bring up several times the comparison. I think Sri Lanka is another England or a Japan in the geostrategic framework as an island off a major continental power. So a lot to be written there. But I want to thank all of you. I want to thank first and foremost Nilanti and Antara for really engaging with the book and giving you some thoughts and sharing with us also their expertise from their vantage point and their research. Thank all of you for joining and excellent questions. We got, I think, a record, I don't know, 30 or something questions, and I tried to bring in some, and I think you've seen them all, so I'm sure you'll know some of these people and engage them. Amish, there's a question of why you're not happy with the Constitution. Good luck with that one. Asanga, a lot of other questions for you on the Tamil issue in particular. But special and most important thanks to both of you for bringing us these two wonderful books, which I really, once again, recommend everyone to get and read, because there's nothing like reading these two books and the details they bring out in how these two countries really look at the international regime and at the region and at India and China. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll continue our work on South Asia. So hope you'll tune in soon again for one of our South Asia events. Thank you all and take care. Stay safe.
Thanks, Tino.
Thanks, Tino.
Thank you, Tino.